Do you know what time it is? It's Supernatural Storytime. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. I don't scare easily. I'm not one to get scared easily, but this story I'm about to tell you is something I'll never forget. It's not long, but it is creepy as hell. Please bear with me as I attempt to recall every detail so you can understand the full scope of my experience. I remember it happened on a hot summer day. It was 1978, and I was 11 years old. A number of my friends decided to head to the lake just outside town, about 2 miles or so away. It was a teen hangout during the dog days of summer in Louisiana, and sometimes we only went to check out the bikinis. Anyway, on this particular day, it was hotter than normal. There were billowing dark clouds off to the west, but still plenty of sunshine where we were at. There were about 5 of us, but when we got to the lake, no one else was there. It was a little odd and disappointing, but we didn't think much of it at the time. The lake is surrounded by a forest of trees, and if you come at the perfect time, the sun shines through, casting a beautiful rainbow on the lake. It was almost that time when we arrived. Jumping in all at once, we splashed each other, feeling the refreshing water hit our skin. After about 30 minutes, it seemed, clouds started gathering more and the sun was hidden behind a huge cloud. "Oh man, this sucks," Jamie said, glancing up through the trees. The wind started picking up and I swore the temperature dropped about 30 degrees. We all got out, all but Charlie, who had drifted further into the middle of the lake. He didn't say anything, but just floated as if someone was pushing him from underneath. "Charlie, come on. It's gonna rain, man," I said to him. But he never responded. Then about 30 seconds later, he went down. I panicked because it was so silent. I quickly swam to where I thought he might be, but he was nowhere to be found. "Guys, we have to find him," I said to my buddies, who all agreed and followed me. We scoured the lake, but still couldn't find him. A few of my buddies were crying, but since I was the oldest, I had to be strong for them. "Okay, guys, chill. Maybe he swam underwater and is right now on the other side of the lake, laughing his head off. We need to go. He's an idiot if he doesn't see us leave and not come after us." I justified this explanation because I didn't have any other. We all took off on our bikes, the rain starting to come down in sheets, pelting us. We reached our neighborhood and said goodbye to each other, each one of us running into our homes that were on the same block. After I showered and dressed, I came downstairs. About an hour later, my mom came into the living room holding the phone. "Josh, have you seen Charlie? His mom said he never came home." I froze, just staring at her. "He didn't?" Now I was freaking out. "No. He did go with you guys to the lake, right?" "Yeah." I then told her the story. "We thought he was playing a joke on us and he would just come home." My mother proceeded to tell Charlie's mom what I said. After, she called the police. About 15 minutes later, we were all at the lake again. The rain had stopped and just a fine mist covered the area, but it was silent. We combed the area around the lake, while police and volunteers searched the lake. We never found him. It's been almost 36 years since the incident. Charlie's mom went crazy. For years, she went to the lake and searched. She said she swore she heard him crying. It drove her insane. Today, she's in the state mental hospital, and I come home every once in a while after having left for Miami a number of years ago. This was an unsolved mystery. Since then, 10 other children have gone missing. 15 years ago, they finally cordoned off the area. Still, some idiot kids didn't follow the rules and found their way back to the lake somehow. They're still missing. What dwells in the attic? My name is 697180-1. My number is 697180-1. I am recording this from memory on the evening of March 29th, with the permission of the warden, as part of his Truth Speaks initiative. When I was first married, some 40 years ago, my wife and I moved into a quaint home in the middle of a do-gooder neighborhood in Tallahassee, the capital of Florida. The Southeast, being as it is, the climate was often hot and humid, leading to several somewhat severe issues with mold. This recollection focuses around what I consider to be the most intriguing incident. It was the middle of July, and if my memory serves correct, 1978. The summer had been warmer than usual, temperatures regularly climbing into the 100s in the middle of the day. Shade was a commodity of which we had little, especially during the day when I was slaving away as a pest control technician for one of the locally owned businesses in town. For 11 hours every day I was forced to spray and pray, laying down gallons of pesticide and hoping on hope that I had enough water left to last the day. The day ended at about 5:30 p.m., the engine of my work vehicle crackling with heat as I parked her for the final time that day. I sprayed her down with the hoses I was provided and turned in my paperwork. I was the last one in for the day and signed off with my manager before heading home in my air-conditioned vehicle. I slid into the driveway some 20 minutes later and walked in, slinging my hat down on the table that I had set up near the door. My wife walked out of the bedroom at the end of the solitary hallway of the house and smiled widely. Her optimism and good spirits remained the only thing that kept me out of Sunland until later that year. "Hey," she said, "how was it?" "Nothing outside the ordinary," I said. Conversation went on as it normally did, my wife casually pouring me a glass of the expensive stuff, an Arbelor 15 I rarely touched. I nodded slowly and took a hold of the glass, smelling the relief before it hit my mouth. I held the smoky whiskey in my mouth for a bit before letting it sink down my throat, the concerns of the day slipping away with it. When the glass was emptied, our clothes littered the kitchen floor and we were already in the shower, barely able to keep our hands off one another. The shower was over as soon as all my evidence from work was rinsed away, the two of us migrating across the hall into the bedroom. We fell backwards onto the bed, heavy in each other's arms. As my wife nipped at my neck, something caught my eye from the corner of the room near the ceiling access. Mold was creeping down from all around the wooden plank that we kept up there to cover the gaping hole. Unable to focus, I regrettably pulled away from my wife and went to examine the ceiling. I stood atop the small dresser we had situated underneath the access and lifted the boards to see if I could see anything that would be moist, drawing the mold to us. Rather than giving way, the boards immediately hit the top of the ceiling, lifting only an inch or two from my force. A strong, musty odor assailed me as soon as the wood was lifted, and I immediately sat them back down, climbing from the dresser and walking to the touch-tone phone that we had installed in the hallway. I dialed the number of our landlord and spoke to her for at least 30 minutes. She was quite chatty about the length of the mold problem. Concerned that there was a leak somewhere in our roof, she advised that she would schedule the roofers to come out later that week. This was on a Monday, and to see what the problem was. Thursday came with no incident, and when the roofer made their way back and forth across the roof, which I had to be home for whatever reason, they apparently found nothing. That's what the manager said, at least, before the whole crew left not 30 minutes after arriving. Having taken the whole day off from work to meet them, I was now faced with 7 hours to occupy myself until my wife would arrive home. I sat in the bed and propped myself up with an impressive back pillow that I had bought my wife for Christmas the previous year. I grabbed a book and cracked it open, enjoying the quiet and imagining the heat that would be assailing me were I outside in my job. A tiny scratching noise interrupted my reading, and as I lowered my book, I realized the sound was coming from the ceiling axis. I quietly set the book down and crawled across the bed, listening closely to the sound. The scratching increased a bit as I got closer, pulling at the sheetrock that lined the room. It was usual to hear squirrels or other small animals on the roof, but this sound was coming from inside the ceiling. There was no debating it. I climbed atop the dresser again and lifted the ceiling axis, half expecting a trapped squirrel to run at me for freedom. Rather than the panel giving a few inches like it had before, it did not budge. I shoved harder, my struggle muffling the sound of the scratching. No amount of force moved the boards at all. I noticed the scratching had stopped, and as I let go of the panel, enormous footsteps came from straight above me, as if some giant were walking on my roof. I ducked and listened intently as the steps moved from above the access panel and stopped 4 feet towards the middle of the room. After a couple of minutes of silence, I reached back up and attempted slowly to lift the access to the ceiling. The boards immediately lifted like they had earlier in the week. Warm air flooded out of the ceiling and onto my arm. The musty odor met my nose again, but something was different now. As I held the access open, more warm air escaped in waves before I realized what I was feeling. I dropped the boards and nearly lost my balance scrambling down from the dresser. The thing that was blocking my access to the ceiling was breathing out of the access. It was impossibly large. I clenched my hands into fists and raised them in front of my face, my arms trembling. There was the usual 5 fingers on each hand, though they were all balled together. Now, I fell backward into the bed and slammed my eyes shut, throwing my hands against my ears to block out further footstomps. I evidently fell asleep like this because I recall nothing else for the rest of that day until my wife arrived home, stirring me from the bed at around 4 p.m. My eyes shot open and I immediately glanced over to the ceiling axis. The mold had seemingly retracted back into the panel, leaving only the pearly white ceiling. I put the incident to the back of my mind and enjoyed the rest of the evening with my wife as best I could. A storm approached as the afternoon advanced, bringing with it moderate rain and distant thunder. We shared an unremarkable meal and regaled each other with the events from the day. I decided to leave out the incident from earlier, assuming it was all a dream, including the visit from the roofers. I went so far as to tell my wife that the roofers hadn't made it and had to reschedule. The sun had been down for 2 hours and the storm was fully on us as we decided to retire to our bedroom for the night. I couldn't afford to take off 2 days in a row, and my wife's shifts, waiting tables at a local diner, provided much-needed cash every time she worked. We each flicked on our reading lamps and sunk into our books. I tried intently to focus on Andrew Jackson as a president, but my eyes kept drifting up from the page and over to the ceiling axis. My wife hadn't mentioned the fact that the mold had receded, and I thought it better than to bring it up. I ducked my head back into history, but my wife had grabbed a slip of paper off the bedside table and was holding it up, examining it. "I thought you said the roofers never came." The invoice the men had left sat in her hand, and as I opened my mouth to speak of whatever excuse I could come up with, the banging resumed. I immediately threw my hands up to my ears again and began yelling to try and cover the sounds, but the footsteps persisted, walking from one end of the room to the other, banging on the ceiling axis and stopping to jump up and down. Some angry god had taken up residence in the tiny space between the roof and my ceiling and was fighting to get out. I thrashed out of the bed and stumbled into the hall, looking back at my wife. I was puzzled at her lack of concern over the stomping giant in our imaginary attic, but lost my balance and sprawled onto the floor as the being stomped once right above me. My wife stepped toward me with worry spreading across her face. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I stood and ran for the front door, the lights flickering and going out as I passed them. I jerked the door open and ran out into the yard, fist still clenched to ears, and spun around to see what horrific thing was stomping around on my house. I sank to my knees and dropped my hands as strikes of lightning and a few stars illuminated my bare roof. My vision blurred and the image of the empty roof swam around my eyes as I toppled over to the side. I saw my wife run through the open front door and into the yard with the same worried look on her face that she had before. She joined the house in its manic dash around my vision, and as I sat on the precipice of nausea, the spinning stopped and I blacked out, oblivious to the stomping and the rain soaking through my nightcoat. So go the words the great Warden Steele have allowed me to share. With his grace shall I live to tell another of my stories. My number is 697180. 1. Note on the patient's records. The patient has since experienced both auditory hallucinations and delusional world building. It is unclear from the patient's writings here whether or not he believes some malevolence was actually living in the attic or if he merely heard the noises. Although it is not explicitly stated, it is my opinion that the patient truly believes something was living in the interdimensional space above his home. If you examine the patient's behavior at the end of the story, at least from what the patient tells us, he leaves the home not to get away from the noise, but to see what is making it. I believe that when the patient runs into the yard and sees once again that the home he has lived in for years does not have an attic, but a flat roof, he collapses into an episode of psychosis and loses himself in his mind. The patient's wife recalled this particular incident first when she brought the case to our attention. A further note on the patient's records. After performing a cursory and somewhat unauthorized search of the patient's records, I found a copy of the invoice left by the roofers. This adds a layer of eerie uncertainty regarding what was really concerning this patient's case and what was fabricated. Regarding the inspection performed by the private company, traces of green mold were indeed found throughout the home, but the foreman of the inspection wrote that no mold was found around the ceiling axis in the patient's bedroom. This leads me to believe, again these are personal opinions and theories, that the patient's wife must have been very worried when her husband dragged himself out of bed and climbed atop the dresser to examine the mold that may have not even been there. It is further my opinion that the patient's wife began doubting her husband's mental state after this first incident. Dead Eyes. I moved into my condominium complex about 6 months ago. It's a little bit of an older building, at least as old as 1978 according to the fading sticker on one of the exposed pipes beneath my kitchen sink, with a real medieval feel to it, English Tudor style brown and white on the outside and perfectly castle-esque on the inside, complete with a suit of armor in the community lobby. There are somewhere close to 20 condos in the building, according to my last count, and the majority of its inhabitants are over the age of 65, which is great for me since they tend to be quiet folk, and I need all the silence I can get from my graduate studies. It fits my taste perfectly, and I really couldn't be happier here. Or at least, that's what I thought, until a couple of nights ago. On the lower level of the building, there's an indoor pool that's open to the building's residents from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. I didn't pay much attention to it for the first few weeks after I moved in, but about 2 months into my graduate program, when the studying really started to get intense, I thought it might be nice to take up swimming as a way to clear my head. Unfortunately, my first couple of trips to the pool were interrupted after about 20 or 25 minutes by other residents coming to use it, and since I'm somewhat uncomfortable with my body type, I didn't stick around long after they showed up. My third attempt was thwarted by a water aerobics class that apparently takes place on Wednesday afternoons, and after that, I pretty much gave up on the idea. A few days ago, I was arriving home after one of my classes when I ran into Kathy, an elderly woman who lives in the apartment next to mine and whom I've become acquainted with since I moved in. We exchanged small talk for a couple of minutes, and when she asked me how my studies were coming along, I mentioned to her that it was getting to be pretty stressful. She asked if I had considered jogging or some other hobby as a stress reliever, at which point I told her about my prior failed attempt to take up swimming. She smiled. "Well, you should have said something earlier," she exclaimed. "Why's that?" I puzzled. "Just come along with me and I'll show you," she answered. I followed her into the building and up the stairs to her apartment. Opening the door cautiously so as not to let her 2 tiny dogs escape, she reached inside and fumbled for something metallic sounding. After a minute, she retraced her arm, closed the door on the 2 eager furry faces panting up at her, and produced a key. "This is the key to the pool area," she said matter-of-factly. "Now, I'm supposed to be in charge of making sure it's locked up every night, but I've got a spare one for myself, and if you promise to lock up when you're finished, I'll let you have this one so you can swim after hours when there's no one there to bother you. Just don't go throwing any wild parties or anything like that," she added, with a grin and a wink. I laughed and thanked her profusely. This would be great. Finally, I had some place to escape from my studies, and now I didn't have to worry about anyone popping in on me. I had a paper due the next morning, so I knew I wouldn't have time to use the pool that evening, but I decided that I would definitely be taking a dip the following night. It was about 10:30 p.m., and I had just finished a long, arduous piece on metaphysics when I decided to take advantage of my new VIP pool pass. Changing into some swimming trunks and grabbing a fresh towel, I left my apartment and padded barefoot down to the pool area. When I reached the door, I noticed that the lights were still on and the door was unlocked. I guess Kathy must have forgotten to come down here tonight, I thought. When I opened the door to the pool, I was greeted by the loud, echoing sound of bubbling water, and when I turned my head to the left, I saw a man sitting in the hot tub. What the hell? Didn't I get this key precisely to avoid encounters like this? I was a little frustrated, to be sure. I thought of asking the man to leave, given that it was after hours, but I figured that'd just be hypocritical given my own presence, and instead of offered a small "Hey," as I walked toward him. The man replied with a mere grunt, and as I got closer I noticed that he was holding a glass bottle by the neck, with the rest of it obscured beneath the bubbling, foamy surface of the water. I wouldn't be sure, but I was fairly certain that the wavering red logo under the water was the same borne by bottles of Smirnoff vodka. Deciding that I was within my rights to say something to him, now that I could see he was in violation of both the time and no alcohol policies, I set down my towel, cleared my throat and said, "Excuse me, sir, there's no alcohol policy in here, and I'd really hate to see that bottle get broken somewhere that people might walk around on it in their bare feet. Would you mind putting it outside?" He had turned his ear towards me when I started speaking, so I knew he had heard me, but he said nothing. I piped up again, "Sir, would you please mind putting the bottle outside?" This time, he let out a long, exasperated sigh, clambered out of the hot tub, and turned to glare at me wordlessly. Our eyes were locked for a brief moment, and my stomach turned. I hate confrontation, and something in particular had me nervous about this 40-something drunken a-hole. His eyes, bloodshot and drooping though they were just so cold, so lifeless. After a couple of seconds, I broke eye contact and looked at the floor. For what felt like an eternity, I could feel those cold eyes still piercing me, but the man finally turned away and headed for the door. When it closed behind him, I exhaled in relief and was pleased to note that it looked like he had decided to call it a night. I got into the pool, swam my laps, and made a mental note to mention Mr. Smirnoff to Kathy the next day. At 9 o'clock the next morning, before I left for my classes, I knocked on Kathy's door to report to her the events of the prior evening. I had heard her two little dogs barking furiously on the other side, and moments later the door cracked open, and Kathy edged out into the hallway, past the two yapping balls of fur. "Well, good morning," she said, chipper as ever. "What brings you by?" "Morning, Kathy," I smiled. "I just wanted to let you know that one of the residents was drinking alcohol in the pool area last night. I wouldn't have said anything, but he seemed super out of it, and since it wasn't a glass bottle, I wanted to make sure he doesn't do it again, so that no one winds up with cut feet in the future. Maybe somebody should mention something at the next condo board meeting." "Oh my, yes. We'll definitely have to make a note of that. What did he look like?" "Pretty average, I suppose. A little taller than me, about 40 or 45 years old, with dark hair and dark eyes." I remembered that cold stare and my stomach turned again. "He was just sitting in the hot tub when I went down for a swim last night." Kathy's eyebrows furrowed. She looked at me apparently confused. "He was where?" she asked. "Just sitting in the hot tub," I replied. "Looked like he'd been there a while, judging by the amount of liquor left in his bottle." Kathy opened her mouth, closed it, and then opened it again before starting cautiously. "But dear, we don't have a hot tub. At least not anymore." Now it was my turn to be confused. "What?" I asked incredulously. "Sure we do. I saw this guy sitting in it last night, with bubbles and everything." Well, dear, I'm not sure what you saw, but it couldn't have been a hot tub. The board had it filled with concrete 7 years ago. But, no, I saw it just last night, I stammered. What was Kathy talking about? There had almost definitely been a hot tub there the night before. Well, let's go look for ourselves, shall we? She suggested. Sure, I agreed. We walked down the stairs and through the hallway to the pool. Kathy was ahead of me, and when she reached the door, she pointed through the glass window and said, See, it's all full of concrete. I got closer to the door, looked through the glass, and couldn't believe what I was seeing. Precisely where I had seen the drunken man soaking only hours before, there was only the outline of what had once been a hot tub, now filled with totally opaque, hard as a rock concrete. Anyway, dear, maybe you just saw him sitting in the shallow end of the pool. Whatever the case, I'll be sure to bring it up at the next board meeting. Have a nice day in class. I couldn't even work up a reply as Kathy walked away. Was I going crazy? There had been a hot tub there. Less than 12 hours prior. What was going on? I turned around and walked up to the community lobby, where I sank into a plush leather sitting chair. I stared at the table for at least 15 minutes, trying to figure out what I could have seen. Finally, I blinked and figured I'd just try to forget about it. I got up and walked over to the building's small lending library, a single shelf of used books that residents had donated over the years for others to peruse at their leisure. Sticking up from between two of the books was a few pages from a newspaper that had been creased and jammed in there, carelessly. Like all the other materials, they were covered with a thin layer of dust. So when I plucked the pages out from between Midnight Desire and Oh, What a Friend We Have in Jesus, I blew the dust off and promptly sneezed. I rubbed my eyes and walked back to the leather chair, sat down in it once again, and unfolded the newspaper. The top of the page was dated June 7, 2007, and the headline read, Turkey Denies Anti-Kurd Incursion in Northern Iraq. I skimmed the front page before flipping it over and reading the backside. I was only a couple of sentences into a short article about computer software when I noticed a section in the bottom right labeled Local News. There was just one story in that section. Area man, 42, commits suicide. The brief piece said that the man had overdosed on vodka and oxycodone, and after the final sentence was a picture of the deceased. I didn't have to take a second glance. I would have recognized those cold, lifeless eyes anywhere. The wrong number. When I was 10 with a small group of friends, the thing that made us laugh the most till we almost crapped ourselves from it. One night we were having a sleepover from my house. One of my friends called a Taco Bell complaining he had diarrhea and he needed something to block it off. After he hung up, we burst out with laughter. After I pulled myself together, I went over to the phone, picked it up, and punched in a random number. There was a man with a gruff voice at the end of the line. Hello, the man said. Yes, hello. Is your refrigerator running? I went with a classic. Everyone else was holding back their laughter. This isn't a real funny joke. I told that joke a long time ago with my friends when we were at a sleepover together. Wait a minute. We were having a sleepover with my friends. All 4 of my friends were staring at me, red-faced, making sure there was no laughter. Suddenly the man spoke, which made me jump. Those were the good old days, with 5 of us all huddled around the phone, all 4 of my friends trying not to laugh. This was incredibly creepy, with such strange coincidences as what was going on with us. Well, you're busy then, I said, and slammed the phone down. All my friends began laughing, almost dying as they gasped in air to breathe. They all wanted to know the details of what the guy's reaction was. I didn't say anything to them. I took a deep breath, taking in everything that happened. Suddenly the phone rang, and I picked it up. Hello, I began. I wasn't done talking to you. It was the same man. What do you want now? I asked. I just wanted to watch that movie you're watching now. I turned and looked. We had the TV on before, and we had never turned it off. Dawn of the Dead from 1978 was on. Yeah? How do you know the movie was on? Did you hear the people talking? Sort of. Can I watch Dawn of the Dead with you? I froze. No. You can't watch Dawn of the Dead with us. You don't know where I live. Sure I do. 22 York Street. Son of a bitch. This guy on the phone knew where I lived. But that made me wonder. Did he look my number up on the phone book? Probably not. Nobody uses phone books anymore, but there is a chance. How do you know? I could be at 27 Beaver Drive. It was just the number I picked up off the top of my head. I'm standing outside 22 York right now. I put the phone aside and sprinted over to the front window. I looked out the window, but the glare from the kitchen and living room light was too bright. I opened the door and peered into the dark front yard. Not a single person in sight. I stood listening to the crickets chirping off in the distance. Then something made me stop and think for a moment. He said, outside 22 York. But he isn't out front. I kept thinking and nearly had a heart attack. He's in the backyard. I slammed the door shut, sprinted by my friends who were now beginning to follow me all over the house, and then went to the kitchen window which looked out into the backyard. I turned the kitchen light off and looked out the window. Nothing to be seen there. Our backyard motion sensor lights flicked on. There was a man standing in our backyard wearing black clothing. Suddenly the man began approaching the back door, which was unlocked. "Oh shit!" I screamed, and I ran towards the back door. I held it closed, but the man grabbed a hold of the handle on the other side and began tugging. I reached up to lock the door, but the man pulled hard. The door began to yank open. I wasn't the strongest 10-year-old on earth, but with adrenaline rushing through me, I held on and managed to keep the door closed enough so that the man couldn't get in. My feet began dragging on the carpet, and I was pulling back. My 4 friends came over and began pulling the door back. Maybe this guy wasn't very strong either to pull a door back from 5 10-year-old kids, but we managed to hold it shut for about 3 seconds. In that time, I threw my arm out and locked the door. We then went around the house locking every door and window. To this day, we never figured out whoever the guy was. He never came back. The whole night we were sitting in the living room with all the house lights on. Although we hope to never see him again, now and then my friends and I sometimes see a man in dark clothing standing in the distance. We often wonder if it was just like kids like us that he wanted to attack, or perhaps we were the ones who got away.